SBO is the best.
Alright, let's lock in. So by the end of this video, you'll be able to explain how exercise affects health. So we're going to look at things like heart disease, blood pressure, cholesterol level, stroke, and all of those different factors. You'll be able to explain fitness changes. So we're going to look at cardiac output. We're going to look at trained versus untrained characteristics and what we mean by maximal compared to sub-maximal. We're going to explain control mechanisms. We're going to explain things like anticipatory rise, vascular shunting, the conduction system, the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous system, CO2 receptors, and all of those things. We're going to be able to explain oxygen transport using concepts such as hemoglobin, myoglobin, oxyhemoglobin, the dissociation curve, and Bohr shift. And lastly, we're going to explain performance concepts such as venous return, Stalin's law, cardiovascular drift, and AVO2 difference. All right, let's zoom out and look at the big picture. When it comes to the cardiovascular system, you need to know that it has three main components. We have the heart, which is the pump. Basically, it pumps blood around the body. We have the blood vessels, which are like the roads that carry blood around the body, away from the heart and towards the heart. And we have blood, which comprises of components that help to carry oxygen, glucose, hormones, and it also helps to take away waste from the body, such as CO2 and other byproducts. And all of these components work together in the cardiovascular system to help with delivery and waste removal. And this is especially important for exercise, where working muscles are going to demand more oxygen, so your body needs to increase blood flow to be able to improve oxygen delivery. And a key equation we need to know when it comes to exercise is the cardiac output equation. Cardiac output is equals to heart rate times stroke volume. Cardiac output being the volume, the amount of blood that is pumped from the heart per minute. Heart rate being the number of times the heart beats per minute, and stroke volume being the amount of blood pumped from the heart per beat. So this is important because during exercise, cardiac output increases to be able to meet higher demand for oxygen, higher metabolic demand by increasing heart rate and stroke volume. Basically, in equation terms, this means when heart rate increases and stroke volume increases, then cardiac output increases by a lot. So don't forget this formula. This shows the relationship between these three variables. Okay, now let's look at why exercise protects the heart. So there are three main things we're going to look at, right? These are really substantial health outcomes, and you just don't need to know the definitions. You need to be able to explain it and apply it. So regular activity lowers the risks of a lot of cardiovascular issues like coronary heart disease and stroke, and also helps with blood pressure and cholesterol control. So one of the health benefits is that exercise improves heart efficiency, and it helps to lower blood cholesterol and blood pressure, and that helps to reduce the risk of coronary heart disease. Secondly, we have high blood pressure, so regular exercise can reduce the risk of hypertension and support a healthier blood pressure. And lastly, we have stroke risk, so regular exercise reduces the risk of stroke because physical activity reduces risk factors like high blood pressure and cholesterol, which overall reduces cardiovascular risk. So when you're asked about this in a question, you can sum it up really smartly by saying something like, training or physical activity or aerobic training strengthens the heart, which improves stroke volume and helps to maintain a healthier blood pressure and cholesterol, which overall reduces cardiovascular disease risk. All right, now let's talk about the short-term control of the cardiovascular system during exercise. So we're going to look at some concepts that are important to know when we're talking about how your body gets prepared for exercise immediately as you start exercising. So first, we have something known as anticipatory rise. So this happens before you actually exercising. Like, have you ever noticed your heart rate rises before you get involved in a game or at the gym or anything? That's what we call anticipatory rise. And this is a pre-exercise increase in heart rate, which is driven mainly by the sympathetic nervous system. So basically, this is your body getting ready for the exercise before you have even started exercising. And this is often linked to an increase in adrenaline and also just an increase in psychological arousal. So basically what happens is your brain sees that you're about to demand a lot of oxygen, demand a lot of blood, you're about to start exercising, then it activates the sympathetic nervous system, which activates an increase in heart rate, and this increases blood flow so that when exercise starts you have enough oxygen for exercise. Next, we're going to look at something known as vascular shunting. So vascular shunting is the process of redistributing blood from areas where it's not needed as much to the areas where it is more essential. And this is because you can't send maximum blood to every organ at once, so the body has to distribute it. And vascular shunting can split down into two components: vasodilation and vasoconstriction. Vasodilation meaning widening of the blood vessels, which increase blood flow to the working muscle, and vasoconstriction meaning narrowing of the blood vessel, which decreases blood flow to the less urgent areas such as your digestive system and other internal organs. What triggers vascular shunting? What triggers vasodilation and vasoconstriction? Well, we have two main triggers. We have neural triggers and we have chemical, or sometimes may be referred to as local triggers. And neural triggers is mainly, again, that sympathetic nervous system activation. When the sympathetic nervous system activates, it triggers vasodilation and vasoconstriction to happen appropriately. Now, chemical or local triggers involve the chemoreceptors detecting an increase in CO2 and acidity in the blood. So chemoreceptors detect CO2 increasing, pH level going down, and this causes it to encourage greater oxygen unloading from the blood, which basically increases oxygen delivery, increases blood flow. All right, now let's look at the nitty-gritty of how the heart actually works. Let's look at what we mean by the cardiac conduction system. So what's so interesting about the heart is that it doesn't just beat randomly. If you put your hand to your chest right now, you feel your heartbeat, you feel the rhythm, but that's not random. It actually follows an electrical pathway that coordinates the way each chamber in the heart beats. And we're going to look at it looking this very, very simple diagram here of a heart that I have drawn. Obviously, the heart doesn't actually look like this. This is just to be able to explain it properly, and I have different components labeled around the heart. If you're not too familiar with the different chambers and the different parts of the heart, then feel free to check out the previous video in this playlist looking at the structures of the heart, or you could even go to the AQA GCSE playlist as well to look at the video on the components of the musculoskeletal and the cardiovascular system. All right, let's crack on. So what happens with the cardiac conduction system is that there is a movement of an impulse from the sinoatrial node to the atrioventricular node to the bundle of His and eventually to the Purkinje fibers. And we're going to look at how each of those happens. So the impulse starts at the sinoatrial node, or the SA node. The sinoatrial node is this node right here. It's found in the right atrium right here. And the sinoatrial node is your natural pacemaker. So the sinoatrial node releases that impulse. The impulse is released, boom, 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 boom. It travels down to the AV node, the atrioventricular node, which is this node here, found around the separation between the right atrium and the right ventricle. So it's sort of in that middle area between the right atrium and the right ventricle. So this is the AV node. So the impulse gets to the AV node. What does it do? The impulse actually waits at the AV node for a little bit. It delays there for a little bit. Why? Because it has to wait so that the ventricles fill. So that impulse that came from the SA node, when it was released, it caused the right atrium to actually contract and squeeze blood down into the right ventricle. Now that the blood is going into the right ventricle obviously has to wait for a little bit so that it fills fully before that AV node can release the impulse to tell it to contract and squeeze the blood out. So that impulse goes from the SA node and it rests at the AV node for a very short period of time, but it delays to wait for the ventricles to fill. And then once the ventricles are filled up, the AV node sends that impulse, which travels down the bundle of His. This is the bundle of His, which goes down the septum of the heart. The impulse travels down the bundle of His and it gets into the Purkinje fibers, which are these branches here, traveling along the walls of the heart. And that impulse and that impulse spreads the signal throughout the ventricle, which causes the ventricles to contract and to squeeze that blood out. And that is basically how each heartbeat happens. So again, touch your heart, you can feel your heart beating. Every time your heart beats, what happens is the SA node releases an impulse. It causes the atria to contract. Not even just the right atrium, both atria, the right and the left atria, they contract, they squeeze blood down into the ventricles. Then the AV node gets that impulse from the SA node, delays it for a little bit, waits for the ventricles to fill up properly, and then releases that impulse, which travels down the bundle of His, spreads out through the Purkinje fibers, and then releases the impulse to create that ventricular contraction so that blood can actually be pumped out. So heart rate changes in exercise happen because the SA node obviously fires a little bit more, which causes heart rate to increase. And simply that is one of the ways that your heart rate can increase, just by the SA node sending out more powerful impulses throughout the heart. So yeah, that is one of the ways that your body can increase heart rate during exercise. Now let's look at the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic. So whenever you hear sympathetic or parasympathetic, sympathetic just means like what happens when you start exercising. So it's a state of your nervous system, the state that you go into, which allows you to increase heart rate and increase the heart's contractility. And parasympathetic system, which is actually stimulated by the vagus nerve, is a state that you go into which acts like a brake to slow down heart rate. So think of the sympathetic system as the accelerator in a car, and then the parasympathetic system is the brake of the car. And if you want to go even deeper into the science, what makes the parasympathetic system very technical is that there is a chemical called acetylcholine that is released when you're in a parasympathetic state. And that chemical is what actually reduces the firing rate of the SA node, which helps to slow down heart rate, to slow down the heart activity. So again, in a nutshell, parasympathetic nervous system drops when you're exercising, sympathetic nervous system increases when you are exercising, and this causes heart rate to increase, stroke volume to increase, and cardiac output to increase. So these are like different parts of the same coin. When you're exercising, it's sympathetic. When you're resting, it's parasympathetic. Now let's look at the cardiovascular. Okay, now let's look at the different receptors you must know for this course. So as intensity increases, as you start exercising, your muscles produce more carbon dioxide and the acidity in your blood increases. This matters because that increase in CO2 and acidity stimulates your chemoreceptors, and it also helps oxygen to unload more easily from the blood at your muscle tissues, which is what we want, right? We want oxygen to be able to come out from the blood and enter the muscles more easily. So these are the three receptors you need to know: the chemoreceptors, the baroreceptors, and the proprioceptors, which detect different things. And these are their definitions here. And the way you put this together in an exam answer, for example, is saying something like, during exercise, chemoreceptors detect increased CO2 and decreased pH level. And this stimulates an increase in ventilation, causing breathing rate to increase, and it also stimulates the cardiovascular system, such as causing heart rate to increase, stroke volume or cardiac output to increase, and ultimately this helps to be able to maintain performance and provide oxygen for the activity. All right, this might be a little bit tricky. This might be the hardest part of this video, so I need you to lock in. When we talk about transportation of oxygen, there are some key terms we need to be able to understand, such as hemoglobin, myoglobin, and something we call the Bohr shift. And this can all be encapsulated in one concept known as the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. So oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And we're going to demonstrate how that happens using this graph which I have drawn here on the screen. So most oxygen in your blood is actually carried by hemoglobin inside your red blood cells. The relationship between oxygen pressure and how saturated hemoglobin is can be shown using the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. So this is the curve here, is an S-shaped curve, and it shows the relationship between oxyhemoglobin saturation and oxygen pressure, which basically means at a given pressure, this is the oxyhemoglobin saturation, and oxyhemoglobin saturation being just how much oxygen is bound onto the hemoglobin. So think about hemoglobin like a truck, right? We have a truck right here. We have a truck right here. Draw a little nice truck right here. And this truck can carry 3 oxygen molecules. 1, 2, 3. So the saturation is the amount of oxygen that it can carry. If this truck could only carry 2 molecules, then that would be a lower saturation at a given oxygen pressure. So what happens normally when you are not exercising is that oxyhemoglobin saturation at a given oxygen pressure is quite low. And basically this truck, this hemoglobin molecule, which is all over your bloodstream, carries oxygen all the way from the lungs all the way to the working muscles. So oxygen loads in from the lungs, and then when it gets to the working muscle, the truck unloads those oxygen molecules into the muscles. We want this truck to be really efficient so that once it gets to the working muscles, it can unload these oxygen molecules really quickly, right? We don't want it to be wasting time. We don't want the oxygen molecules to get stuck to the truck. So we want a low affinity. And affinity means attraction. We want to get to a state of low affinity between hemoglobin and oxygen. And that's what happens during exercise. What happens during exercise is that oxygen and hemoglobin have a lower affinity to each other, which means that hemoglobin can't carry that many oxygen molecules. So maybe instead of 3 oxygen molecules, this truck can only carry 2. But the benefit of that is that it can unload a lot more quickly because there is less oxygen to unload. So the way hemoglobin works is that even though less oxygen is binding onto it, that oxygen can unbind a lot quicker. And that is the state we want to get to. And that is what we describe as the Bohr effect. So the Bohr effect is when an increased CO2 and or lower pH level reduces hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen, so oxygen can unload more easily in the tissues. And the Bohr effect is what happens as a result of the Bohr shift. So the Bohr shift is when this oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve shifts to the right during exercise because of these conditions: increased CO2, lower pH level, higher temperature. And again, this makes unloading of oxygen a lot more easy at the muscles. And finally, this is another key term you need to know: myoglobin, which is an oxygen store found within your muscles. Now let's talk about venous return. Venous return is simply the process of getting blood flow back to the heart. So these are the main mechanisms you need to know for venous return. We have valves, skeletal muscle pump, respiratory muscle pump, and vasoconstriction. So these are very straightforward. Valves just means these structures in your veins that you have to stop the backflow of blood. So let's say this is your foot, right? Poorly drawn foot, but this is a vein in your foot. Your veins have these pocket valves. They're referred to as pocket valves sometimes. These pocket valves, which are like doorways that stop blood from flowing back down. So let's say blood flow is obviously returning back to the heart through the veins. Once it goes up, these pocket valves sort of stop it from flowing back down, and that helps with the venous return. So that is one mechanism of venous return. We also have skeletal muscle pump, and this is simply when your muscles around your veins contract to squeeze veins. So again, if we go to the drawing of your foot here, let's say we have your muscles at the front of your lower leg here, muscle at the front of your lower leg, muscle at the back of your lower leg, and then we have a vein here. When you move around, if you flex your ankle or whatever you do with your leg to contract your muscles, these muscles contracting will squeeze on this vein, almost like when you squeeze a tub of toothpaste to be able to push the toothpaste up. So that's what happens. It squeezes on the veins to push the blood up towards the heart. So that is what we mean by the skeletal muscle pump. Next, we have the respiratory pump, which is again a similar thing as the skeletal muscle pump, but more to do with the respiratory muscles and more to do with pressure changes that happen during breathing. And lastly, we have vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction is actually triggered by the sympathetic nervous system. So vasoconstriction is sympathetic narrowing of veins. Okay, some more key terms for you. So when we talk about blood pressure, we have systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure, and you need to understand the difference between the two. So what happens during exercise is that during exercise, systolic pressure typically rises because cardiac output is rising, obviously. Meanwhile, diastolic pressure may stay at a similar level or change slightly depending on vasodilation. This is why usually it's important to mention vascular shunting when you are talking about blood pressure. Now let's look at something known as Starling's law of the heart. So Starling's law of the heart is really simple. Starling's law says the more blood that returns to the heart, the more the ventricles fill and stretch, and this creates a higher stroke volume because of a stronger contraction. So basically it's saying that the higher the venous return, the higher the stroke volume, because the higher venous return means more blood entering the heart. That causes the chambers of the heart to stretch, and as a result, they're going to contract more strongly to release more blood from the heart per beat, thus a higher stroke volume. So whenever you're talking about Starling's law of the heart, it's worth referring to elasticity and contractility. Another important key term is cardiovascular drift. So cardiovascular drift is a phenomenon that happens during long duration, steady state exercise. This happens when heart rate gradually rises, even when the intensity and the pace of exercise stays the same. And it usually happens when you've been exercising continuously for around 20 minutes or more. So what happens is that heart rate rises and rises and keeps rising and keeps rising because your blood becomes a lot thicker, because when you're exercising for long you sweat, and that reduces the amount of water in the blood, which makes it a lot thicker. And because your blood has become thicker, your heart has to work a lot harder to pump that blood out per beat, which is why heart rate increases a lot. So as we've described, when you're talking about cardiovascular drift, you want to refer to dehydration, water loss, and also heat, and you can also mention stress. AVO2 difference is basically how much oxygen is taken from the blood by the tissues, and it links directly to something known as the Fick principle. You don't need to know too much about the Fick principle. It's just a boring concept that states that blood flow to a specific organ can be calculated in a specific way. But what you do need to know is understand how AVO2 difference impacts performance, and also this formula. And this formula shows us two main things. It shows us cardiac output Q, and it shows us AVO2 difference. And basically the way this links to performance is that you can improve performance by increasing Q, pumping more blood from the heart per minute, and also by increasing AVO2 difference, extracting more oxygen at the muscles. And this is also what sets the difference between trained versus untrained individuals. Trained individuals usually have a higher max cardiac output and also have a higher ability to extract oxygen at the muscles. And also, trained performers usually have a lower heart rate because their heart muscles are stronger and bigger, so they can achieve the same cardiac output with a higher stroke volume and a lower heart rate. And this all again comes down to the fact that apart from just having stronger and bigger heart muscles, they have a better ability to extract oxygen, to unload oxygen from hemoglobin. So basically that Bohr shift, that Bohr effect happens a lot more efficiently in trained individuals compared to untrained individuals. All right, that is it for this video. Again, like I mentioned before, this one was a little bit tricky, especially when we started talking about the Bohr shift, the Bohr effect. So if you feel like you want to practice more, do some more exam questions, delve deeper into it, then I highly encourage you to check out our platform, Super PE Online, for more resources to help you to ace your exams. And also feel free to check out the other playlists as well. Sometimes A-level content might require you to be able to be familiar with some GCSE content, so feel free to check out the GCSE playlists as well if you want to be able to refresh your knowledge. All right, see you in the next video.